So, hello Earthlings. I'll stop doing the intro soon, but I am aware that new people are probably coming along all the time to these, so just explain that I've been a vegan since 1979, involved in the grassroots of the movement in the main, done all kinds of stuff, no stuff, a little bit. I'm now a sociologist, and I want to talk today about three things which are all connected to the work of a sociologist called Richard Gale. Now, Richard Gale wrote an interesting paper in Sociological Perspectives in 1968, and this is really relevant to the animal movement right now, and I think in three ways. Basically, what he's talking about is the relationship between social movements and their counter movements. Now, academics have a fairly kind of fancy way of talking about this relationship. They call it the movement counter movement dialectic, just a middle class way of saying the relationship between the two, and most academics have talked about this relationship between a movement and the counter movement. In fact, a good definition of a social movement is an organized group of people who are trying to bring about some change or resist change in some major aspect of society. That's quite a good definition of what a social movement is. And also, you notice in that definition it talks about changing society or resisting some change in society, and so that implies this relationship between the people who want to bring about change and the people who are trying to stop that change being brought about. So that is the relationship between a counter movement and a social movement, and I suppose a classic example of that would be pro-choice versus pro-life, that kind of issue. Okay, now what Richard Gale does for us in this 68 paper is he says, rather than talking about the relationship between social movements and their counter movements only, which is like a dyad, a two-part kind of idea, we should be thinking in terms of a three-part thing, triad thing, which is the relationship, the complex relationships between social movements, their counter movements, and state agencies, government agencies. And so he's got quite a complex model, which we don't need to go into, but he talks about kind of, pre-movement and movement death and all this kind of stuff. But essentially what he's kind of saying is that not only do a social movement and the counter movement have a relationship, but also they each have a relationship with government regulatory agencies. And I think this plays into the importance here for us in three ways. It talks about animal rights and animal welfare, and it talks about reducetarianism and veganism, and I think it also talks about the issue of mainstream. I want to try and kind of develop that a little bit. It's going to be a bit of a sketch really, because I'm going to try and do the three, but I might come back to it in more detail one by one maybe if need be. But what I really mean is that I've argued for a while that you don't need to do animal welfare to get animal welfare. You can do animal rights to do that, and a classic example of that would be that if you're doing your single issue event, I tend to think that single issues are better if you think about it as events rather than campaigns. If we're doing a single issue event and abolitionizing them, in other words saying, well, this is a single issue, we're vegan animal rights advocates, we're opposed to animal use, this is a form of animal use, and therefore we're opposed to it, but we're not just focused on this, we're focused on everything. It's just that at the moment we're outside your circus, as it were. Now, what tends to happen is if you make an animal rights point outside a circus, other animals have rights, we have no right to use them, when we use them there are rights violations. If we do all that, invariably the circus responds with animal welfare because it's the only thing they can do. They can't address animal rights. It's too radical for them for a start, and so they always respond with animal welfare, and that's what tends to happen with animal use and animal users across the board. We talk about animal rights, they talk about animal welfare. It kind of gets slid down or translated down into animal welfare. Now, do we need ourselves to engage in the welfare arguments? And this position is saying that we don't. And the reason being is that the animal users are also in contact with the state agencies. And so this is how it would go. If you were to, say, through animal rights claims making, cause what you might call turbulence within society about the issue of animal use, say at the circus, what then would happen is that eventually, as it were, it would get to the minister in charge, as it were, of circuses or animal welfare across the board, and they would then go to the circus and say, look, we're actually getting a lot of shit here because, you know, there's this expose that's happened, you know, somebody's released a film, there's all kind of you know, upset going on, there's people writing to the press and making vlogs and writing blogs, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. Radio stations are contacting me, TV are interested. Now if we can create that as a social movement, then the minister then gets onto the circus and says, look, you're going to have to do something about it. Now the only thing that they can do is they can try to tighten up on welfare. They can't go, oh, okay, that's animal rights, we'll close down. They're not going to do that. They're going to go, okay, well, we'll try to tidy things up, especially if there's been some kind of expose. So the upshot is that by campaigning for animal rights, we kind of get animal welfare along the line anyway. We don't have to campaign for it. You know, there's other examples of it where, you know, they found that eventually they found that the factory farming system is not working too well. They thought initially after the war that the best thing to do is just cram all the other animals together as intensive as possible in order to maximize profits, forgetting really that they're talking, you know, about a psychological and a biological system when you're talking about mammals or birds. And so they react, therefore, to being thus confined in the same way as we do, if we're all imprisoned in a very kind of strict kind of way. And so, you know, in later years, it's turned out that they're trying to then, you know, moderate what they do. For example, veal, they're thinking of, you know, like group confinement rather than, you know, the classical kind of veal crate, this kind of thing. Although they've gone into these kind of little kind of like hut things now as another alternative. But what effectively they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out ways of, you know, lessening the problems created by their intensification. And what the animal rights movement have done, or the animal movement, the animal rights movement in inverted commas, is that they've latched onto the fact that there's some changes coming on in the system already. Another one would be, rather than shackling and electric stunning chickens, for example, there's this idea of controlled atmosphere killing. Okay, now this is a thing that the industry is bringing about already, and it's a kind of move that's in the air, and these are the things that are being talked about in the journals. And what the animal movement do is they latch onto that, start a campaign about it, and then this thing that's going to come along anyway, they can claim a victory and fundraise about this kind of classic thing that the national groups do. And there's an ironic thing in a way, because there's reform, welfare reform, that is in the air and in the pipeline. And ironically, by starting a campaign about it, you might slow it down, ironically, because the industry doesn't like to be seen to be caving into pressure from the animal movement, And so therefore they then suddenly start to resist it, and the industry and their spokespersons and representatives and that, they've also got their constituents and who they've got to keep happy, and they're not going to suddenly start looking as though they're going to cave in just because some arsehole group like PeTA have said, okay, well we've identified this problem, which, you know, has long been known in the first place. So that's the first argument. We don't actually need to campaign for animal welfare to get animal welfare. Now I'm talking about vegan animal rights people. I'm not talking about the RSPCA or Compassion in Wolf Farming, these welfare groups that's what they do. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about animal rights people. If we stand for animal rights, we can talk about animal rights, and ironically we'll get welfare along the line anyway. If we then switch to reducetarianism, this idea that we kind of needed to have some kind of name for people who are reducing, as it were, on the way or not towards veganism, well, you know, do we really need all that crap as well? You know, we get people coming up to the vegan stall in Dublin all the time, and they're saying things like, well, you know, I'm cutting back, you know, and I've been cutting back for a while, and I want to move towards, you know, what you stand for, and I can see the point. And you know, we had some person saying they've been really struggling with moving towards veganism for a year, but essentially the guy was saying that he's been cutting back. Now, we don't need to have a movement or a group called cutting backism or cutting backanaryism or whatever friggin' weird thing it would thing like reducetarianism. We don't need that. People know how to reduce. They don't have to be told to reduce. They don't have to be told their baby steps. They can do that. If they are convinced that there's an animal rights case, if they're convinced that veganism is a good thing, they don't need to be told, well, this is the first step, the one step, the first step, the baby step. They don't need all that, you know. I mean, who do we think these people are? I mean, they can think, they can go, okay, this is actually a good argument. I'm sympathetic to this. How can I move towards that in negotiation with my family and peers and all the other social things that go on and all that, right? It's a complex kind of situation, but they don't have to be told, okay, well, the first thing you do is X. You know, you can leave that to them, you know. So we vegans don't need to get involved with reducetarianism at all. But people will reduce because of vegan arguments, because they want to move that way, because if veganism as an argument and a philosophy makes sense to them, then they'll move and they'll reduce. But we don't have to come up with an idea like reducetarianism in order to kind of, you know, oil those wheels. They're turning already. And then finally, I want to make this kind of point in relation to the mainstream. Now, I think the mainstream thing is quite a complicated issue, and I want to start by showing a bit of a video, a clip. Patrice Jones, the mighty Patrice Jones, made a great speech called Commonalities of Oppression, and I just want to extract a little bit out of it about the mainstream as follows.
The mainstream is not the majority, right? You know this, right? The so-called mainstream is not the majority. Add up all the people outside the mainstream, that's the majority. Okay, so when we target our message here, we're doing like maybe the exact opposite of what we need to do, because it's the folks who are oppressed by the system, who are best able to see the intersections between their own and have the motivation to help us throw down the system. You see what I'm saying?
Okay, so Patrice Jones there, reminding us that the word mainstream can kind of get a bit complicated in our mind, because I think what we tend to do is think, well, mainstream, the word, means the most, the majority. And what they're claiming here in this video is that this is not true. Actually, the majority are not in the mainstream. And so that then begs the question about our audience. Veganism as a radical idea, animal rights as a radical idea. Do we want to go for the mainstream? Now, that's not to say that it wouldn't be good if the mainstream does stuff. You know, the Bill Gates comes along and pours billions into producing, plant-based meats, for example, that would be okay. Now, whether we have to be involved with that is another matter. In fact, there's probably reasons why we probably don't really want to get involved with the mainstream. We can let the mainstream come along in our wake, as animal welfare will come along in the wake of animal rights. And the reason for that is that, come on, who's in the mainstream? Mainstream people, who are they? You know, people who vote for Theresa May, people who vote for Donald friggin' Trump. These are mainstream people, aren't they? You know, do we want them? Now, obviously, eventually we're going to want them to go on a plant diet. We would like them to embrace the philosophy of veganism. Whether they would, in their right-wing way, do all that, don't know. But is that really our audience? Is it, you know, or is it the fact that we as a social justice movement need to improve our relationship with other justice movements? And one of the ironic reasons why it's hard to do that is because we go for the mainstream. And so PeTA being an example here. PeTA actually cater for the racists and the sexists in the movement and in society. Is that what we want? You know? Especially when the people who are arguably our more natural allies, the ones in other radical social justice spaces, they are actually alienated and put off, and also given an excuse by us, by the way, to not become vegan and not to check out the vegan message, because if they can say, well, you're aligned with PeTA, they can just dismiss us, because they're not going to have anything to do, you know, with a group that promotes racism and sexism and ableism. You know, why should they? You know, we can't form alliances with them. We can't talk to them about total liberation. We can't talk to them about pro-intersectionality, because they just go bollocks. We don't want to make alliances with you lot, you know, who commodify women, who dress up as the Ku Klux Klan. We don't want anything to do with you. And then we're left saying, well, hang on, you know, we're not them. You know, that's a mainstream animal group. You know, that we're not into that. You know, it's a real problem. You know, we're going to have to think about this. Who are our audience? And given the fact that veganism and animal rights are radical ideas, our audience may well be other radicals in society. And as Patrice Jones says, they turn out to be the most people. So rather than getting too hooked up and hung up about what mainstream means, and, you know, failing to understand that they're not the actual most people, then maybe our audience, you know, and maybe the movement as a whole has actually been going after the wrong audience for quite a few years. And that might explain, actually, why there are so many sexists, racists, and even fascists, certainly people who use ableist language all the time, in the vegan animal movement. Maybe it's because we've been targeting the wrong audiences in the first place. Be interested in what you might think of these arguments in those three areas based on this Richard Gale thing, this triangle idea: movement, counter-movement or counter-force, the people opposed to us, and the state. How does that play out in terms of animal rights, animal welfare, veganism, reducetarianism, and our ideas about what the hell the mainstream is and who our audience is? Okay, Roger Yates, Roger and out. Roger Yates signing out. Yeah, okay, bye for now, and I'll catch you next time.